Hello and welcome to this presentation on unconscious bias as we celebrate Black History Month in the middle of a pandemic in the International Year of the Nurse and Midwife. We're sharing this presentation with you today to think about how we are better able to challenge and change both organisations and ourselves when it comes to tackling bias, discrimination and inequality, both in the workplace and outside it. So I'm delighted that you're with me. And I hope that what we'll share is something that you're going to find interesting, challenging, and also empowering. So let's go. Our first slide then is an explanation of what unconscious bias is. And it's basically our unintentional people preferences. And they're the result of our limited cognitive capacity as we implicitly and automatically both group and categorize people to avoid having to conduct completely new assessments for each person that we meet. So think about it. Every time we see a cute baby, our response is possibly the same. We might see a group of young people wearing hoodies walking towards us. We might actually start to jump to an assumption about what they might do to us. So we unconsciously assign both positive and negative value to the categories we use. And it's really important to realize that neutrality doesn't exist in this space. We think that someone is safe and that's good, perhaps not so safe and therefore not good. We think that someone might be like us, which might be good, or unlike us, which we might conceive of as bad. So it's really important to recognize that unconscious bias is essentially our unintentional or unspoken of or covert people preferences. We're going to then talk about the neurology of bias. So there's been quite a lot of thinking and writing and commentary in this space. And the current, I suppose, consensus is that we all have bias. And they're often in our personal bias black spot, or blind spot rather. Most of us don't really have that much insight into where our unconscious biases are. What we do know is that in terms of the neurology of bias, unconscious bias is triggered by different parts of the brain, allegedly. They are enacted between 300 and 100 milliseconds, so really, really, really fast. Conscious thinking, the slower thinking, the more rational and deliberate thinking, takes much longer to actually occur, to even begin processing. Unfortunately, the smart part of our brain is lazy. It likes to work really efficiently and it likes to minimize the work of the frontal lobes, which is where all of this kind of neural activity takes place. What the brain fires together, it wires together and it forms emotional associations. And these are rapid and very automatic when they occur. So bias has a neurology. And it's wired together in our brains, and it's often the part of our brains where the unconscious processing takes place. And that unconscious processing is extremely powerful and likes to be really active. In contrast to the smart part of our brain, the brain that makes the rational decisions, the brain that thinks things through, the part of the brain that actually thinks, can this really be true? We need to investigate further. That part of the brain, unfortunately, takes a lot longer to get going. So let's then look at some facts about the brain. The smart brain is lazy and limited in resources. It's also true that our unconscious thinking processes, our unconscious brain often processes its alleged or thought around 200,000 times more pieces of information than the slow thinking conscious brain. The other thinking about unconscious bias is that we are hardwired to categorize everything we see, hear, and to form emotional associations with those categories. So they are good or bad, but never indifference. And all of this complex processing has an impact on our attitudes in both subtle and obvious ways, as well as our behaviors, and crucially, our decision-making processes too. So let's just show you a little bit more information about what that looks like in terms of systems of thinking. So there's a really great book that we'd recommend having a read of by Daniel Kahneman, and he talks about system one thinking. It's your first reactions. And the evidence is that most of our thinking, 95% of our cognitive activity takes place in a system one, and that's fast, automatic, impulsive, takes very little effort, and it's often based on our emotional responses. This feels good, this feels safe, this is somehow like me. System two thinking is the bit of the brain where we make rational, critical decisions. And sadly, the evidence suggests that we only use that 5% of the time. It's slower, it's deliberate, it's reflective, it's harder work, and it's analytical. And I guess the key thing that we are going to have to think about when we're looking to tackle unconscious bias is how we can bring much more of our thinking, particularly where we're making decisions about people and allocating resources, whether that's jobs, to system two thinking. And that's slower, it's more deliberate, it's reflective, takes more effort, but it is analytical. But the results, the evidence suggests, are really, really powerful in terms of shaping workplace cultures, but also ensuring equality of opportunity. So there are some scenarios that place us at greater risk of paying less attention to our bias and then falling prey to the kinds of cognitive tricks that they can perform on us. And so there's quite a lot of evidence that when we're placed under emotional loads such as stress, anger, and frustration, we're more likely to act in biased ways. We're more likely when we are faced with a cognitive load to, because we're required to make really quite complex decisions, to try and find some shortcuts. And again, this is where bias might rear its ugly head. And then the other kind of interesting thing, and I think this is what supports my chocolate habit, is that our emotional and cognitive resources are depleted by being tired or hungry. So we must remember then that a key part of tackling unconscious bias really does depend on us caring for ourselves, resting well and hydrating well. So you may have, in the last kind of 6 months, have been in situations where you have felt stress, anger, and frustration. There will probably have been many times where you have been under a significant cognitive load. And if what we know or what we believe to be true, we know that actually many of us are feeling tired at the moment. And so the importance of taking care of ourselves in order to create a fairer and kinder workplace must be taken really seriously. So we've talked about unconscious bias as a generic thing, but there's evidence of many, many different kinds of bias. And here are just a few examples. We might well be judging people based on how they look, beauty bias. And I think I've seen so many examples of this with senior female leaders or politicians being judged on what they wear, or how they wear their hair. We might see lots of affinity bias where people might well be recruited because they are the same as us. Maybe they went to the same universities, same part of town, studied the same subject. But if you are like me, I might well be more tempted to believe that you are going to be a safe person to be around. There might be a horns effect, maybe as the result of stereotyping. There may well be some negative assumptions about us that cloud the judgment of others. The evidence is as well that confirmation bias is alive and well. What we might do is when we make a snap decision about somebody, we will then look for evidence that supports that initial decision. So confirmation bias is where we start looking for evidence to support our initial suppositions about a person or a group. We might well engage in a bit of attribution bias. How many of us have heard that, Black people are supposed to be great at dancing or sports, or people from other groups are supposed to be really great at maths? So the attribution bias is how we might perceive the actions or abilities of others. Conformity bias is a very powerful one where we change our opinions to conform with the group. And again, that's a really kind of powerful thing when it comes to thinking about workplace culture and the ways in which bias of any kind shows up in the workplace. And then we might also have a halo effect, where others may be seen as having more positive traits than some. We might describe, the ability to be really passionate about work in one person as evidence of great and really dedicated leadership in another that might be seen as aggressive. And so we might have a halo and a horns effect in operation in those cases. Now, there's quite a lot of information that there are over 172 different types of bias, and it's really interesting to kind of work out on a day-to-day basis just how bias impacts on us. So we've spoken to you about unconscious bias, and you might be thinking, well, what can I do? God, if this is happening in my brain. But actually, the evidence is that we are really very powerful in challenging and changing ourselves as well as organizations into recognizing and tackling the impact of unconscious bias. And this model, this pause model, I think is a really interesting one. Firstly, it asks you to pay attention to what's really happening with your thinking. So when we start to pull our thinking from a system one, which is the fast, rapid, barely above the level of our conscious attention, into firmly within our sights, into firmly within our kind of mental gaze, we start to really begin to think about, well, what really is happening here for me right now? And we also need to make sure that in the A of this, that we're acknowledging and noticing our first and initial reactions to a particular response. So let's be curious rather than condemn ourselves. Thirdly, we need to think about how we understand and allow ourselves to be open to exploring alternative responses and judgments. So if you've had or grown up with the belief that interactions with a particular group of people are going to be dangerous, how might you be open to exploring alternative responses, or perhaps exposing yourselves to different experiences that give your brain a contrast? The S of this then is about thinking about how we might seek or search to find a much more productive way of tackling this issue. So, typically people, when we're thinking about bias, tend not to want to tackle this issue, tend to want to avoid it. And that generally isn't a productive way. In fact, it hides and masks quite a lot of significant issues. So I guess it's about being curious about other ways in which you could do that. And we'll share some information about how you do that later. And then the E of this is about thinking about how you do this consistently. What we do know is that practice makes perfect. When you first start doing it, it can feel really awkward, but the evidence is, and certainly the feedback we've had from others, is that when we start to really kind of question ourselves and to start thinking about what's prompted this view inside me, or why am I behaving in this way? Or I'm curious about why I'm feeling a little bit, nervous about this person. Those are the spaces where we can actually create some really tremendous change. I've got some questions for you, and I'd like you to kind of think about these as you kind of go about your day-to-day business, but also just to kind of think about them the next time you encounter somebody who is perhaps not somebody that you would normally meet, or somebody that sits outside of your normal group of people that you might encounter, or perhaps you read something in a newspaper. And it's about asking you, can you recall a time when you've made a snap judgment about someone's personality? I'm curious about what went on for you. What did you notice about your own responses? Second question I have is, in what ways do you notice the impact of unconscious bias in the workplace? We know that unconscious bias has a huge impact on things like recruitment, sponsorship, mentorship, all of those things. And I'm just curious about, what are you starting to notice in your own workplace? And then finally, what biases do you hold? And that isn't an admission of guilt. This is simply an exercise in curiosity, in understanding how you work. Now, when I did a quick audit of some of my biases, I realized that I have huge biases around accent, around body shape, and a whole lot of stuff. And it was important for me to recognize how they worked, so that in scenarios where I was making key decisions, I was able to make myself fully accountable for making the right decisions for my organization and not holding on to or serving my bias. So this is quite a lot of information I think we're trying to kind of cram in here, but I wanted to leave you with what I think might be some useful next steps. So you might be interested in thinking about how you might want to build your knowledge of how to be a great ally in the workplace. And tackling your own unconscious bias is going to be a really important step in that. You must also want to listen to our Nursing While Black podcasts. And there are a series of really kind of powerful stories and narratives from nurses and healthcare support workers from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic backgrounds, all sharing what it is like to live their lives. And some of the prescriptions that they have about the things that can create change across organizations, but crucially, some of the work that we all can do to make things better for all of us. If you're interested in learning a bit more about unconscious bias, I'd recommend a book called Fast and Slow Thinking by Daniel Kahneman. But also, if you're interested in learning more about the ways in which, for example, discrimination on the grounds of race and a lot of the kind of unconscious assumptions that people make, the kind of negative kind of impacts that we might see around race, if you're interested in learning a bit more about that, then watch our race, racism and nursing webinars that were recorded over the summer. And then finally, you might want to connect with us on Twitter. So you can connect with @RCN_inclusion to find out much more about the work that the RCN is doing around this issue, but also on many, many others. So we hope that you really have enjoyed this session. We hope that you answer the questions, and we hope that you feel engaged, empowered, and excited about what comes next, particularly in terms of thinking about the resources that we have available for you, but also the kinds of conversations that we think can create massive change, not just for you, not just for your colleagues, but also for your patients too. Thank you very much.